The sound of laughter filled the air as Lena Hart stood frozen in the middle of the flight simulation room, her face pale and her heart sinking like a stone, while the bright red words flashed across the big screen saying, "Mission failed," and the room echoed with voices that were not kind at all. They laughed. They pointed and they whispered to each other as if she was not even there. Lena had dreamed of being a pilot since she was a little girl. She had watched her father fly his jet into the sky, and every time she had promised herself that one day she would follow his path. She had studied harder than anyone else in her class. She had stayed awake at night, reading manuals and memorizing codes. She had practiced every control until her fingers hurt. But now, after months of effort, she had failed her final test in front of everyone. Her classmates could not hold their laughter. One boy said maybe she should try cooking instead of flying. Another girl whispered she only got in. Because of her father, the laughter grew louder and Lena's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She stood tall, even though her hands were shaking inside her gloves. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but she kept her head high even when the pain inside her chest was unbearable. Captain Royce, her instructor, stood at the back of the room. His arms crossed and his expression hard as stone. He had seen many cadets fail, but something about Lena made him pause. She had heart. She had determination, but rules were rules and failure meant disqualification. He looked at her and said quietly, "Cadet Hart, report to my office after the session." His voice calm, but heavy with disappointment. The laughter followed Lena as she walked out of the simulator room, her boots echoing down the empty hallway. The sound of her heartbeat louder than anything else. She reached the locker room and finally sat down, her hands covering her face. She could still hear their voices in her head, the way they mocked her, the way they said she would never make it. She whispered softly to herself, "I will prove them wrong. I have to." Later that evening, the sun was setting over the training base, the sky painted in shades of gold and red. Lena sat alone on the bench near the runway, watching the fighter jets take off one by one, their engines roaring like thunder. She loved that sound. It reminded her of home, of her father, of the stories he told her about courage and fear, and how real pilots never give up even when everyone says they should. She closed her eyes and remembered the day her father left for his last mission. He had knelt in front of her and said, "Promise me you will follow your dream no matter what happens." She had nodded, then hugged him tight. It was the last time she saw him alive. The memory burned in her heart like fire, and every time she wanted to give up, she thought of his smile, his words, his promise. The next morning, she stood in front of Captain Royce in his office, his desk covered with papers and flight reports. He looked up at her and asked, "Do you know why you failed?" Lena swallowed hard and said, "I lost control during the crosswind turn, sir." He nodded slowly, but his eyes softened for a moment. He said, "You have potential, but skill is not enough up there. It takes calm, it takes instinct. You must learn to trust yourself, not just the machine." Lena nodded again, her voice small but strong. "I will try harder, sir." Captain Royce sighed and said, "We'll see, the next evaluation is months away. You can reapply if you want, but until then you're grounded." Lena saluted, then turned to leave. But before she stepped out, he said quietly, "Your father would have been proud of your effort. Don't let one failure define you." Those words stayed with her for days. She spent every free hour in the hangar, watching the mechanics fix the aircrafts, studying the controls again, practicing with old simulators that nobody used anymore. Sometimes she stayed so late that the lights went out and she had to walk back to her dorm in darkness, but she didn't care. She was not going to give up. Not again. The other cadets still whispered behind her back every time they saw her cleaning the jets or sitting alone. With her notes, one said she is wasting her time. Another said she will never fly. But Lena ignored them. She had learned that silence was stronger than anger. She focused on her dream the same way her father had taught her. One night when the moon was high and the air was still, she stood near the edge of the runway again, watching the stars above, the same stars her father once flew beneath. She whispered to herself softly, "One day, I will prove them wrong. One day, I will show them who I am." But As she stood there, she noticed something strange far away on the horizon, a faint flash of light like a spark that didn't belong to the stars. It faded quickly, but it made her heart beat faster. She didn't know why, but something deep inside told her that everything was about to change, that her next test would not be in a simulator. It would be in the real sky with real danger and real choices. And while everyone slept in peace that night, Lena Hart stayed awake, staring at the distant sky, feeling a quiet storm rising inside her. Something told her that soon the laughter would stop, and the world would see what she was truly made of. The morning began like any other at the airbase. The sun rising slow and golden over the hills, the sound of jets warming up in the distance, the cadets lining up for drills and roll calls. Lena Hart stood quietly at the end of the line, her eyes still tired from a night without sleep. She had spent the whole night studying the radar systems. Again, she wanted to learn every sound, every signal, every little thing that could make her better. The others around her were laughing, talking about weekend plans and practice flights they still whispered when she passed by. But Lena no longer cared. Their laughter had turned into background noise, something that no longer hurt but instead pushed her harder. Captain Royce walked across the runway, his sharp voice cutting through the morning air. "Attention," he shouted. The chatter stopped. Every cadet stood straight today. "We will begin emergency response training and radar observation drills." Lena's heart skipped. She had been reading about radar systems for days, but she had never worked on one for real. When Captain Royce called her name, she almost thought it was a mistake. But he said, "Cadet Hart, report to Radar Room 3. You will assist Officer Daniels." Lena saluted, trying not to show the excitement rising in her chest. The radar room was dim, the air cool and filled with quiet. Beeping sound screens glowed with green circles and flashing dots. Officer Daniels was an older man with kind eyes. He looked at her and smiled slightly, saying, "You must be the one who studies late at night. I see you from the hangar window." Lena felt her cheeks grow warm and said softly, "I just want to understand everything." Sir, hours passed slowly as she watched him work. He explained how every movement on the screen could mean something. How to read patterns, how to tell the difference between friendly aircraft and unknown ones. Lena listened closely. Her mind absorbing every detail, she started noticing small things that others might miss, like faint blips that disappeared too soon or signals that came from strange angles. She began to love it. She felt alive again, like she had found her place. The sky outside turned gray as clouds rolled in by evening. Thunder rumbled far away and wind began to shake the glass windows. Officer Daniels leaned closer to the radar, squinting a bit, and said, "That's strange." Lena stepped forward and saw a new dot flickering on the edge of the screen. It was small, weak, almost like static, but it was moving fast. Daniels adjusted the settings, but the signal faded. He frowned and said, "Probably a glitch. These old systems pick up all sorts of noise." Lena nodded, but something about the signal stayed in her mind. It didn't feel like a glitch, it felt deliberate. She didn't say anything, though. She didn't want to sound foolish again. Not after all the laughter she had already faced. Later that night, the storm hit hard. Rain poured down on the base. Lightning flashed across the sky. Lena sat by her window, unable to sleep. The image of that flickering dot kept returning in her mind. She imagined it was something more, something coming closer. The wind howled through the dorms and thunder shook the walls. She hugged her pillow tightly and whispered, "Maybe I am just tired. Maybe it was nothing." The next morning the storm was gone, the sky clean and bright as if nothing had happened. But as the cadets gathered for breakfast, an uneasy feeling lingered in the air. The communication team was checking all equipment again. The base commander walked through the cafeteria, talking quietly. With Captain Royce, their faces serious. Lena watched them closely, her stomach twisting with worry. By afternoon, the sirens went off, once sudden, loud and sharp. They echoed across the entire base, making every heart jump. The red emergency lights flashed, and the voice of the commander came through the speakers. "All units report to stations. Unidentified objects detected approaching from the east." Lena froze for a second, her tray falling from her hands as everyone started running, shouting orders and questions. Some thought it was another drill. Others looked terrified. She ran out, following the others toward the radar building. Officer Daniels was already inside, typing fast on the console. his voice shaky. This is no glitch, this is real. We have multiple signals approaching at high speed. Captain Royce burst into the room, his expression fierce. What do we have? Daniels answered, unknown crafts, no identification, no communication response, sir, they're closing in fast. Royce grabbed the radio, calling the control tower. Prepare already. Pilots for immediate launch, we might be under attack. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the screens. The dots moving closer and closer like a swarm. She wanted to help, but she had no clearance. She wasn't even allowed near the aircraft. Any more, one of the cadets who used to mock her shouted, "You better hide hard. This is no simulator." She ignored him, her eyes locked on the radar as she whispered, "They're too close." Then the lights flickered, the power surged, the base shook slightly, as the sound of distant thunder or maybe explosions rolled across the air. The commander's voice came through again. All units brace for impact. This is not a drill, repeat. This is not a drill. Lena ran outside the wind, whipping her hair across her. Face smoke rising already from the far side of the base, alarms screamed louder than ever. Jets were being rolled out. Soldiers shouting over the noise, the ground trembling beneath her boots. She saw Captain Royce running toward the hangar, shouting, commands, his voice hoarse in that moment. Lena understood that everything had changed. The laughter, the failure, the endless nights of doubt. They didn't matter anymore. What mattered was survival. What mattered was the base, the people, and the promise she made to herself. She stood there watching the sky as black shapes began to break through the clouds, their wings shining against the rising sun. And for the first time, she didn't feel small or scared. She felt ready. Something deep inside her whispered that this was only the beginning. The airbase was no longer quiet. The calm sky of the morning had turned into a field of smoke and noise. The sound of sirens mixed with shouts and the roar of engines. The ground shook under every step, as soldiers and cadets ran in all directions trying to understand what was happening. Lena Hart stood near the hangar, her hands trembling as she watched the chaos unfold around her. Jets were being rushed onto the runway. Pilots jumped into cockpits. Without even finishing their checks, mechanics shouted commands. Radios buzzed with static and confusion. It was like the entire world had changed in a single heartbeat. Lena felt her chest tighten as she looked up at the horizon where black shapes were now moving fast, cutting through the clouds like knives made of shadow. Captain Royce ran past her, shouting orders to everyone on the ground. He didn't even notice her. At first, his face was covered in sweat, his uniform darkened by smoke from the burning supply tents. He stopped for a second, looked at the sky, then yelled into his radio, "Delta Squad. Take the north side, Bravo team, guard the hangar, and someone get that radar back online." Now Lena wanted to move, wanted to help, but she didn't know where to go or what to do. Her training had ended at failure. She had no orders, no position, no authority. A jet roared above her, taking off and vanishing into the smoke. Seconds later, a bright flash tore across the sky, followed by a thunderous boom. The explosion made everyone duck instinctively. Metal fragments rained down onto the runway. Lena covered her head as a burning piece of debris landed only a few meters away. The smell of fuel and fire filled her lungs. Officer Daniels stumbled out of the radar room, coughing, his voice shaking as he said they hit the communication tower. "We've lost half the systems." Captain Royce grabbed his arm and said, "Get it running again, whatever it takes." Then he turned and finally saw Lena standing. Frozen in place, he frowned and shouted, "Hart, what are you doing here? Get to the bunker now." But Lena couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the far end of the runway where one of the pilots had fallen. His jet still sitting untouched, its engine humming, waiting for a command. The pilot wasn't moving. He must have been hit by shrapnel. She ran toward him, ignoring Captain Royce calling her name. Smoke burned her eyes, but she reached him and saw that he was unconscious, breathing shallow. The jet was still active, the control lights blinking like tiny stars. She looked back and saw that all the other jets were already in the air, fighting against the dark shapes above the base. Explosions flashed across the sky like red lightning. One of the cadets shouted at her, "What are you doing? Get away from there!" But Lena didn't listen. Her mind was screaming only one thing: "This is my chance." Her father's words echoed inside her head. "You must follow your dream no matter what happens." Her heart pounded louder than the sirens. She climbed into the cockpit, her fingers shaking as she touched the controls. She knew she wasn't allowed to fly. She knew she could be punished. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. She strapped herself, enclosed the canopy, and whispered quietly, "Please let me do this right." The radio crackled with static. Then Captain Royce's voice came through unknown pilot. "Identify yourself." Lena pressed the button, her voice soft but firm. "This is Cadet Lena. Hart, I'm taking defensive position." Royce's voice turned sharp. "Hart, this is not your place. Get out of that jet now." But Lena replied, "Negative, sir. There's no one else on the ground I can help." There was silence for a moment. Then a sigh came, through the radio, followed by his voice, lower but steady. "Then fight, cadet, and make it count." Her hands moved on instinct, powering up the thrusters. The jet vibrated under her control as she rolled it forward. The wind roared louder. The flames on. The ground reflected on the metal surface. She looked ahead and saw the open sky filled with enemy fighters. The same sky she had once dreamed of conquering now, burning with chaos. The moment the jet lifted off the ground, Lena felt the force push her back into the seat. The base below shrinking as she climbed higher, the sound of explosions and gunfire echoing in her ears. She gritted her teeth and turned toward the incoming enemy aircraft. They were sleek, fast, and deadly. One fired a missile that streaked past her wing, leaving a trail of fire. She pulled hard on the controls, the jet spinning and diving. She almost lost control, but caught it just in time, her heart racing. Captain Royce shouted through the radio, "Enemy at 3 o'clock. Heartbreak left now." She turned sharply. The jet shaking from the strain, a blast of air and smoke filled the cockpit. But she kept her focus, her eyes scanning the sky for targets. She spotted one of the enemy jets chasing another pilot. She locked on and fired her first missile. It hit dead center, the explosion lighting up the clouds like a star. She couldn't believe it. She had just taken down her first enemy. Jet cheers erupted over the radio, some of the pilots shouting that she had saved them. Lena felt her chest swell with emotion, but she couldn't celebrate. Not yet. There were still more coming, dozens more, and the sky looked darker every second. She gripped the controls tighter, whispering to herself again and again, "Stay calm, stay focused, stay alive." As she turned back toward the base, she saw flames spreading near the fuel storage area. If those tanks went up, the whole base would be lost. She pushed her jet lower, flying dangerously close to the ground, debris flying everywhere. Her vision shaking from the impact of the wind, she saw soldiers below trying to put out the fires, waving frantically as she passed. She heard Captain Royce again over the radio saying, "Hart, we are losing the south wing. We need backup. Now." Lena looked toward the south and saw enemy fighters diving down in formation, ready to strike. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the throttle to maximum and shot forward, the noise of the engines louder than thunder. She whispered one last promise to herself, and to her father, "I will not fail again." The roar of the jet filled Lena Hart's ears as she pushed the throttle forward, the engines screaming like thunder behind her. The ground spun far below as the air rushed past the canopy and the base grew, smaller and smaller in the distance, smoke rising like dark clouds across the runway. The sound of explosions echoing in her mind. She had no time to think, no time to be afraid. Her hands moved on instinct, and her heart beat faster than it ever had before. The radio buzzed again, Captain Royce's voice shouting through the static, "Lena, enemy fighters approaching from the east. Stay alert." She turned her jet sharply, feeling the weight pull her to one side, the horizon spinning, blue sky mixing with orange fire. She gritted her teeth and focused. She could see them now. 5 enemy jets flying in a V formation, their black wings cutting through the sunlight like blades, each one moving with perfect precision. They were faster, stronger, and more experienced, but Lena didn't care. She had something they didn't, her will to prove herself. She pulled the jet higher, climbing above them until her controls trembled from the force. Then she flipped upside down, diving straight toward the lead fighter. Bullets flew past her cockpit, streaks of red light flashing by. She twisted the controls again, dodging each shot by inches. Her training flashes returned in her mind. All those long nights studying, all those mistakes, all the laughter of her classmates, every sound turned into fuel for her courage. She aimed a locked target and pressed the trigger. One missile fired straight ahead, hitting the first enemy jet in a burst of fire. The explosion lit up the clouds, and for a moment, everything stopped. The other enemy pilots scattered, flying in all directions. Lena rolled her jet through the smoke, searching for the next target. Captain Royce's voice came again, sharp but proud. "Good shot. Hart, keep moving, do not slow down." She felt a rush of energy. Through her body, the fear fading, replaced by something new. Determination, power, maybe even pride. She had finally proven she belonged in the sky. But then a warning light blinked on her control panel radar lock. She gasped and twisted her head. A missile was coming right for her. She pulled hard on the stick, throwing the jet into a spin. The world turned into a blur of blue and orange. The missile barely missed her tail, but the shock wave hit hard, shaking the jet and sending it downward, alarms blaring. Inside the cockpit, her hands fought the controls, trying to steady the fall. She felt the weight of gravity crushing her into the seat, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Come on. Come on," she whispered. "You can do this." At the last second, she regained balance, the jet leveling just above the ground, the base flashing by beneath her. She could see soldiers running and shouting below their faces, tiny and terrified, as the sky burned above them. Captain Royce yelled over the radio, "Hart, report status." She replied, voice trembling. "I'm hit but still flying, sir." He answered, "You're doing fine, keep them away from the base." Lena turned her jet back toward the enemy formation. She could see smoke rising from their wings. They were regrouping, preparing. For another strike, her fuel gauge was dropping fast. She knew she didn't have long. She thought of her father, of his last words to her. The promise she made on that runway. She whispered to herself again. "For you, Dad. For everyone." As the enemy jets dove toward the base, she followed them from above, waiting for the right moment. The wind howled around her cockpit. Her vision narrowed, her heart steady. Now she fired another missile, then another, both hitting their targets. One enemy jet exploded into a ball of fire. The second spun out of control, disappearing into the clouds. She smiled for a second, just a second, before another blast shook her from behind. The shock sent sparks across her screen. The enemy was firing back, relentless and cold. Her wing was damaged, smoke trailing behind her. The controls heavy, but she refused to turn away. She pushed forward, weaving through debris and fire, every second feeling like an hour. The radio filled with desperate voices, some crying, some shouting. Command. She could hear fear everywhere, but inside her heart there was only calm. She had never felt more alive, more certain of what she was born to do. Suddenly she saw it through the smoke. A huge shape moving slowly across the horizon. A massive aircraft, darker and heavier than the others. It wasn't a fighter. It was a bomber heading straight for the base. Her breath caught in her throat. She understood immediately what it meant. If that bomber reached the base, it would destroy everything. Everyone. Captain Royce must have seen it too, because his voice came through almost breaking. "Hart, do you see it?" "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I see it." There was silence for a moment. Then he said, "Every jet is too far. You are the only one close enough. You have to stop it." She looked at her fuel gauge, at the smoke filling her cockpit, at the bomber moving steadily closer. She knew what she had to do. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "I won't let them down." She turned, her jet toward the massive plane, accelerating as fast as her engine could go. The wings shaking from the pressure, the air screaming around her. She aimed for its weak spot near the center engines. Bullets flew toward her, but she didn't stop. Not for a second. The sky around her turned into chaos, fire, wind, and metal spinning everywhere. She locked her aim one final time and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. Her missiles were gone. She stared at the empty indicator and whispered, "Then I'll do it myself." She pushed the throttle to maximum speed, heading straight for the bomber's body, her hands shaking, her eyes wet, her heart calm. From the ground, Captain Royce watched the two jets racing toward each other. One tiny and fast, one massive and dark. His voice breaking as he whispered into the radio, "Lena, pull away now, that's an order." But there was no answer. Only static and the roar of engines as she kept flying straight ahead, her jet a streak of light cutting through the smoke. toward destiny. The sky was a storm of smoke and fire as Lena Hart flew straight toward the massive bomber, her hands gripping the controls tight. The roar of the engines filling her chest, her damaged jet trembling like it would break apart at any moment. Below her, the base looked small and fragile, covered in flames and dust soldiers running for cover, their faces pale with fear. The radio filled with voices shouting orders, crying for help, praying for survival. But Lena heard only the sound of her heartbeat, steady and strong as she focused on the dark shape ahead. The bomber was huge, its metal body shining like black steel under the burning sun, its engines growling like monsters, its guns turning slowly toward her streams of bullets, cut through the air, missing her by inches, sparks flying across her cockpit. But she didn't flinch. She kept going faster, closer, her eyes locked on the target. She whispered quietly to herself, come on, you can do this. You have to do this. Captain. Royce's voice came through the radio again, loud and desperate. Lena, abort mission, pull away now, that is a direct order. She bit her lip, her throat dry, her eyes full of tears, and said softly, negative, sir. If that bomber reaches the base, we lose. Everything I can stop it, I know I can. The silence that followed was heavy, only the sound of her breathing filling the cockpit. Then Captain Royce said, voice breaking, Hart, you are one of us now. Do what you must. Her jet rattled violently as smoke poured from the side, the alarms blaring, warning lights flashing across the screen she could barely see. But her mind was clear. Every second felt like forever. The bomber loomed closer now, so close she could see the symbols painted on its wings, the glass of its cockpit. The faint outline of the pilots inside her chest burned with emotion. She thought of her father, of his last smile, his last promise. She whispered, for you, Dad. The bomber's guns fired again, tracer rounds streaking past her. Wings one grazed her tail, sending sparks across the sky. She jerked the controls left, avoiding the next barrage, then rolled right and dove below the bomber, its shadow swallowing her as she flew underneath. She could feel the heat from its engines, the vibration from its power. She aimed carefully at the underbelly and fired her last machine gun. Burst bullets tearing through the metal, but it wasn't enough. It kept flying strong and unstoppable. Lena screamed in frustration and pulled up behind. It flying closer than ever before, she knew she had one choice left, one that no pilot ever wanted to make. She remembered the simulator lessons Captain Royce had once given her, his words echoing in her head. Sometimes a pilot must choose between living with fear or dying with purpose. She smiled faintly and whispered, then I choose purpose. Her voice came through the radio one last time. This is Cadet Lena Hart. I am going in. Tell my team, I did my best. Captain Royce shouted, no, don't you dare, but it was too late. She pushed the throttle to full speed, the jet shaking wildly, pieces flying off the wings, the wind roaring louder than thunder, her tears floating in the air inside the helmet. She felt no fear, only peace as she aimed for the bomber's fuel tank right below its left engine. The impact came like lightning, a flash brighter than the sun, an explosion that tore through the clouds. The bomber erupted into a ball of fire, breaking apart in midair, fragments raining down. Across the sky, the shockwave rolled through the base, knocking soldiers to the ground. The sound so loud it felt like the world itself was screaming. Then silence. Only the sound of wind and the faint echo of the explosion fading away. Captain Royce fell to his knees, staring at the sky, his headset silent, his voice barely a whisper. Hart, do you copy? But there was no answer. Only static. He clenched his fists, his eyes filled with tears, his voice trembling as he said to the others, she did it, she saved us. The cadets stood in stunned silence, watching the flames slowly fade away, the black smoke twisting up into the heavens like a dark ribbon. None of them spoke for a long time. The girl they once laughed at, the one who failed the test, had just done what no one else could. The base was safe because of her courage. But then a shout broke the silence. One of the soldiers pointed upward. Look, a small figure was falling from the sky, a parachute opening white and bright against the dark. Smoke, the crowd gasped as the wind carried it gently downward. Captain Royce ran across the runway, his heart pounding as he shouted, "It's her. It's Lena." The parachute landed roughly near the runway. Lena rolled onto the ground, coughing her uniform, torn her face covered in dust and ash, but she was alive. The medics rushed to her side, helping her up. She tried to stand, but her legs shook. Captain Royce reached her first, pulling off his helmet. His eyes wet. He said, "You crazy brave girl, you actually did it." She smiled weakly, her voice almost gone. "I told you, sir, I wouldn't fail again." The base around them was still burning, but the worst was over the enemy jets retreating into the distance. The smoke clearing slowly to reveal the sun breaking through the clouds, casting golden light over the wreckage. It felt like the world itself was breathing again. The cadets who once mocked her now stood in silence, their eyes wide with respect. One of them whispered, "She saved us all." Another said she's a hero, and the laughter that once haunted her was gone, replaced by awe and gratitude. "Captain," Royce put a hand on her shoulder and said, "You passed the hardest test of all, Lena. You proved what it means to be a pilot." She smiled faintly, looking at the sky where the smoke still danced with light, and whispered softly, "Maybe I finally made you proud, Dad." The wind carried her words away into the open air, and as the sun rose higher, the base slowly came back to life, the sound of hope returning with every heartbeat. The girl who once failed had become the name everyone would remember forever. The air around the base was still thick with smoke as the sun climbed higher, spreading soft light across the broken runways and burnt hangars. The sky that had been filled with fire only minutes ago now shone a calm golden color, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath after the chaos. Soldiers moved quietly, carrying the wounded, helping each other, and trying to understand what had just happened. The enemy was gone. The danger was over, but the silence that followed felt heavy like a memory, too strong to fade. Lena Hart sat on the edge of a metal crate, her parachute folded beside her, her uniform covered in ash, her hair sticking to her forehead, her hands trembling as she tried to drink a small bottle of water. Every breath she took burned in her chest, but she didn't care. She was alive, the base was safe, and for the first time in her life,